They dragged it from beneath the ground. That is how this story concludes. A sealed formation entombed under the landscape of Turkey for what could be 4 millennia. And when contemporary science finally got to it, what returned was not a resolution. It was a warning. The findings were seized. The location was secured. And the individuals present have remained silent ever since. But you need to grasp how we arrived at this point, because what took place inside that mountain did not start with imaging equipment or dig crews. It started with a passage most people ignore. It started with a vessel that has no right to exist. And it started with a question that once it enters your mind, you will never be able to put it down. How did we end up here? Let me walk you through it. For hundreds of years, the account of Noah's Ark occupied the place where most ancient narratives settle, somewhere between conviction and rejection. You encountered it in Sunday school. You watched it played out on flannel boards. A wooden ship, animals marching aboard in pairs, a rainbow when it was over. It was reassuring. It was well known. And for the majority of people, that is precisely where it remained. A tale for children wrapped in the language of faith, too bizarre to accept at face value, too holy to abandon completely. But there has always been a difficulty with leaving it there. Because the narrative does not exist solely in Genesis. It exists in Mesopotamia, it exists in Greek mythology, it exists in spoken traditions throughout India, Central America, the Pacific Islands, and hundreds of native cultures with zero exposure to Hebrew texts. More than 200 separate civilizations preserve some form of a devastating flood. A planet submerged, a single family preserved, a craft that ferried life through annihilation. The names differ, the specifics vary, but the framework of the account remains unchanged. And that is the sort of detail that science refuses to leave untouched. In 1959, a Turkish military officer named İlhan Durupanar was examining aerial images captured during a standard survey flight over eastern Turkey. The vast majority of the landscape appeared exactly as terrain ought to appear: rock, gradient, altitude, shadow. But a single frame stood apart. Resting in the mountain earth close to the Ararat region, plainly visible from overhead, was a form that had no reason to be there. An enormous, symmetrical, vessel-shaped impression embedded in the soil like the remains of something that was never meant to endure. From ground level, you would pass right by it. It resembled any other hillside. But from altitude, it was undeniable. Over 500 feet in length, narrowing at one end, curved at the other, shaped in a manner that did not appear geological. It appeared constructed. Now, initial researchers arrived and departed. Some declared it a mudflow feature. Others insisted it was an artifact of erosion, volcanic material, or tectonic pressure. The human mind detects patterns where none are present. That much is certain. And for years, that reasoning was sufficient to keep the location overlooked. But it did not remain overlooked. In the late 1970s, a man called Ron Wyatt arrived. Wyatt was not a trained archaeologist. He was a nurse anesthetist from Tennessee who had encountered a photograph of the formation in Life magazine, and something about it refused to release him. Across the following 22 years, he poured himself into the site and into dozens of additional biblical locations, asserting he had identified close to 100 biblical artifacts, from the Ark of the Covenant to the stone tablets bearing the Ten Commandments. His followers named him God's archaeologist. His detractors labeled him a well-meaning amateur who projected biblical expectations onto natural features. And both camps had legitimate ground to stand on, but the formation itself was indifferent to the argument. It simply remained there. 500 feet of symmetrical terrain waiting. If you are still with me, I need you to carry something in your thoughts. This is not a narrative about a single individual or a single location. This is about what unfolds when the instruments finally match the mystery. Because what altered everything was not belief. It was not even debate. It was technology. In 2021, a group of Turkish archaeologists returned to the Darupanar Formation carrying equipment Ron Wyatt could never have accessed. Ground-penetrating radar, three-dimensional subsurface modeling, chemical soil testing at a degree of accuracy that would have been unthinkable just 2 decades prior. Their declared objective was measured and precise. Establish whether the formation is natural geology or something manufactured. No presumptions, no bias, just evidence. And the evidence refused to align with the comfortable narrative. The GPR readings uncovered something beneath the surface that brought the team to a standstill. Not solid bedrock, not scattered rubble, organized form. Parallel lines extending the full length of the formation. Right angles, long consistent beams, stacked sections resembling decks, symmetrical compartments flanking a central spine. Corridor like passages linking interior zones. Recurring structural configurations 8 to 20 feet below ground. The kind of characteristics you encounter in construction, not in natural weathering. One of the engineers present stated it directly. Natural stone does not produce straight and uniformly spaced corridors or beams like this. This is intentional design. And then there was the soil. Specimens extracted from within the formation were chemically distinct from specimens taken from the adjacent mountainside. The interior earth held traces of marine substance. Organic remnants, mineral profiles that did not correspond to the regional geology. Vegetation growing immediately over the formation behaved differently from vegetation growing mere meters away, as though the ground itself retained the memory that something alien was interred below it. Now consider what that implies. A vessel-shaped formation high in the mountains of eastern Turkey. Internal framework that appears manufactured. Earth containing oceanic material thousands of feet above sea level. Measurements that come remarkably near to those recorded in Genesis chapter 6, verse 15. 300 cubits in length, 50 cubits in width, 30 cubits in height. The ratios are not exact, but they are near enough to make dismissal difficult. And here is the portion of this account that most people never encounter. The Turkish government responded. They classified the area as a protected national park, acknowledging its cultural and historical weight. Let me be explicit. That is not a formal declaration that Noah's Ark has been located. But governments do not safeguard barren hillsides without cause. Something about what rests beneath that earth was sufficient to justify protection, but the Darupanar site is not the sole thread in this tapestry. The hunt for Noah's Ark has persisted longer than most people appreciate, and it has drawn everyone from ancient chroniclers to Cold War intelligence operatives. Flavius Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, recorded that remnants of the Ark were still visible in the mountains of Armenia, the territory that encompasses Ararat. In 1876, a man by the name of James Bryce ascended past the tree line on Ararat and returned with a section of crafted timber. He was forthright enough to concede that ordinary explanations were plausible, but the wood itself proved harder to account for. During World War I, troops and aviators crossing the region described seeing what appeared to be a vast wooden form lodged in ice near the peak. In 1949, United States intelligence imagery reportedly captured a dark, irregular shape high on the mountain. Years afterward, a Hong Kong-based organization called NAMI asserted they had discovered wooden chambers deep within Ararat, though that assertion later encountered significant doubts about fabrication. The cycle is always identical. A claim surfaces, enthusiasm swells, specialists investigate, and then the claim either falls apart, stagnates, or lands in an uneasy middle ground where it cannot be validated but will not vanish. But here is what separates the current research from everything before it. It does not rest on eyewitness accounts that resist verification. It does not rest on a lone expedition by an unqualified enthusiast. It rests on reproducible scans, chemical evidence, and structural imaging. And each time the team activated the instruments again, the findings returned unchanged, organized, symmetrical, consistent with intentional design. One researcher expressed it this way: "This is not ordinary. Now I need to bring you somewhere you would not expect, far from the mountains entirely." In 2012, Robert Ballard, the man who located the Titanic on the floor of the Atlantic, directed his focus toward a different body of water, the Black Sea. Ballard was not searching for an ark. He was searching for proof of a catastrophic flood occurrence that might illuminate why so many ancient peoples share the same recollection. His hypothesis, constructed on prior scholarship, was extraordinary. Approximately 12,000 years ago, as glacial sheets from the last ice age dissolved, the Black Sea was not a sea at all. It was a freshwater lake, more compact, lower in elevation, encircled by human communities along its edges. And then the Mediterranean surged through. The waters of a climbing ocean crashed through what is now the Bosporus Strait with a power estimated at 200 times that of Niagara Falls. The lake transformed into a sea. Approximately 150,000 square kilometers of populated terrain disappeared beneath salt water. Settlements were swallowed, coastlines were erased, and those who escaped carried a memory of water that consumed the world. Ballard's team discovered an ancient coastline 400 feet below the surface of the present-day Black Sea. Shell analysis pointed to roughly 5000 BC. The findings did not confirm the Genesis flood narrative, but they achieved something nearly as significant. They gave the flood tradition a historical framework, an actual catastrophe, an actual displacement, an actual explanation for why civilizations divided by oceans and thousands of years might all preserve the same terror. Suddenly, the worldwide heritage of a great flood ceases being merely a myth and begins being a memory. And that returns us to the mountain, to the formation, to what the imaging found that no one had anticipated. Because the further the team probed, the more unusual the readings grew. The radar echoes from particular segments of the structure did not respond the way timber or rock ought to respond. The signals indicated something metallic, reinforcement in beams or connections. The variety of engineering that, if authentic, would surpass what most scholars believe was achievable during the ancient Bronze Age. And then there was the coating. Chemical evaluation of material from the internal walls revealed a substance aligned with pitch or tar. This is where scripture ceases being backdrop and moves into the spotlight. Genesis chapter 6, verse 14. God instructs Noah to coat the ark inside and out with pitch. The Hebrew term is kopher. And kopher does not merely signify waterproofing, it signifies covering, protection, sealing, a barrier between what is within and what is without. Reflect on that for a moment. A substance discovered in the walls of a buried formation in Turkey corresponds to the material God directed Noah to apply. And the word describing that material means more than simply blocking water. It means containment. The ark was not merely a rescue craft, it was sealed. And this is the juncture in the account where the atmosphere shifts. Because once you cease viewing the ark as a children's tale and begin viewing it as an actual structure engineered to withstand divine judgment, the passage that follows Genesis 6 assumes a gravity that most people have never experienced. Genesis chapter 7, verse 16, and the Lord shut him in. That verse has been recited 10,000 times as a declaration of divine safeguarding. God closed the door. God preserved Noah. And that is accurate. But there is another layer to it that the surface interpretation overlooks. If God himself was required to seal the door, then whatever existed on the far side of that door was not something Noah could have confronted alone. The sealing was not ornamental, it was essential. Now I want to be straightforward with you. Some of what has been conveyed from this location moves beyond verified evidence into terrain that reads more like a thriller than an academic paper. There are reports of sealed chambers producing unexplained thermal signatures, assertions of anomalous readings, stories about officials closing the site and seizing information. Some of these particulars originate from sources that weave documented reality with dramatic narrative, and I want you to receive them with careful judgment. The formation is real. The scans are real. The soil irregularities are real. The correspondence to Genesis dimensions is real. But the question of what precisely occupies the deepest strata of that formation has not been resolved publicly. And the quiet surrounding it speaks louder than any official statement. What we do know is this. The most credible, honest assessment is that the Derupanar formation is not confirmed to be Noah's Ark, but it is anomalous in ways that existing explanations have not completely addressed. It calls for more drilling, more imaging, more peer evaluation, and more openness. And the reality that it has not been ruled out after decades of examination tells you something that should command your attention. Because here is what the doubter and the faithful both must confront. If this is merely geology, it is the most stunningly deceptive geology on the face of the earth. A vessel-shaped form containing internal architecture, ocean-sourced soil, pitch-like substances, and dimensions that echo an ancient manuscript. All positioned in the one mountain range that manuscript identifies as the landing place of a craft constructed to survive the fury of God. At a certain point, coincidence stops serving as a satisfying explanation and starts functioning as an evasion. And this is larger than archaeology. This is about what the narrative signifies if any fraction of it is physically rooted in the ground. Because the Ark account is not fundamentally about a vessel. It is about a warning that went unheeded. Genesis recounts that in the era before the flood, humanity was eating, drinking, constructing, marrying, existing as though the next day was assured, and a single man perceived something the remainder of the world declined to perceive. Noah did not possess proof that the flood was approaching. He possessed a word from God, and he built regardless. For years, before neighbors who believed he had gone mad, he drove nails into timber while the heavens remained clear. He applied pitch while the land stayed parched. He followed a voice that no one else could detect, and when the waters arrived, that faithfulness was the sole barrier between his household and obliteration. Jesus referenced that moment directly. Matthew chapter 24, verse 37. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. That is not poetry. That is prophecy, and it traces a direct line between the generation that mocked Noah and the generation that will be caught unaware by what arrives next. Observe the world at this moment. Observe the apathy. Observe the diversions. Observe how effortlessly people reject the notion that judgment is real, that God communicates, that ancient warnings still hold authority. The days of Noah are not a figure of speech for some remote era. They are a mirror raised before the present. And the formation concealed in that Turkish mountainside might be the most disturbing reminder that the mirror is faithful. If you have stayed with me to this point, you are not watching passively. Something within this message is resonating with something within you. And I want to ask you to do a single thing before this video concludes. If this Christ-centered Christ, pointing Christ, honoring content is meaningful to you, if it reshapes how you perceive your faith and how you perceive the world, subscribe to this channel and leave a comment below sharing with someone else what you are carrying away from this. Not for algorithms, for the Christ who cautioned us, who delivered us, and who is returning. Because here is the element of the account that most people overlook. The ark was not the destination. The ark was the instrument. The destination was that God recognized one man who listened when the whole world had grown deaf. And he carved a passage through the deluge for that man and every soul connected to him. The timber and the pitch and the measurements were merely supplies. The true architecture was obedience. And the true question this buried formation poses is not whether Noah's Ark has been discovered. The true question is whether you are constructing yours. Because something remains sealed within that mountain. The imaging has not ceased producing anomalies. The earth still bears chemical markers that do not belong to the terrain around it. The dimensions still echo Genesis, and with each passing year, the instruments grow more refined, the evidence grows more resistant to dismissal, and the silence from the officials who secured the site grows weightier. The ground still conceals secrets. The past has not finished speaking. And the next occasion you open Genesis 6 and 7, you will not find a children's tale. You will find a blueprint. You will find a warning. You will find a God who sealed a door because what was approaching was real, and the only place of safety was within. That door remains open. But the skies will not stay clear indefinitely, and somewhere beneath the rock and earth of a mountain in eastern Turkey, the evidence is waiting for the moment it no longer needs to remain silent, because by then, every living soul will already understand what Noah understood. The water is coming, and it has already started to rise.